Hey, what's up, house groups? You guys are stuck with me for at least one more week here as we continue our Fresh Start series where we've been kicking off 2023 talking about how to recognize, release, and redeem our regrets so we can step into the futures God has for us. That's really difficult to do when there are parts of our stories we desperately wish weren't a part of our stories. But I want you to know, no matter how far you've fallen from the place you wanted to be or the place you used to be, your story is redeemable. Michael Phelps probably fell further than anyone. I mean, he was on top of the world. Maybe the greatest athlete that ever lived, not named Michael Jordan. He won 28 Olympic medals, 23 of them gold. Just unbelievable stuff, but behind the scenes, he was depressed and addicted. He admitted that during the 2012 London Games, he was struggling with mental health so deeply that afterwards he just binged on alcohol and drugs. And a couple years later, he got arrested for DUI for the second time. And he was embarrassed and he isolated himself and thought about committing suicide. He was literally suicidal until some friends and family members stepped in and convinced him to go to rehab. And as he was headed into rehab, somebody handed him the book Purpose Driven Life by Rick Warren, who's a pastor out in California. And Phelps read it, and it absolutely transformed his life. Like, he just crashed into Jesus in that book and found a sense of purpose that he had been missing, even while it seemed like he had this great purpose of being, the greatest swimmer to ever live and the greatest Olympic athlete to ever live. And so Phelps actually saw his story and his life pulled out of this suicidal, depressed place and redeemed to a future with maybe an even bigger purpose than he had before. Like he had this purpose of individual glory and he achieved it. But then he became a spokesperson for A, what God can do to redeem a person's life, and B, how important mental health is in sports. And he became an influencer all around the world to people who were struggling. And I know some of us have stories that need to be redeemed. And you may not have had a rock bottom moment like Michael Phelps, where you're like on a cocaine bender thinking about committing suicide. But I want you to know that no matter what's broken in your story, God wants to take your regrets and turn them into a story of redemption. And he can do the same thing for you that he did for Michael Phelps. Romans 8:28 promises us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. That he's always working to take us from the shattered space we currently inhabit to the future he's got for us. And embracing that, living into it, requires some stuff on our end. First and foremost, it requires humility. It requires admitting, hey, I can't pay this price on my own. The word redemption that we use in the New Testament, I said it Sunday, I'll remind you of it again. It's apolutrosis. It means to buy back from. It was used to describe the process of buying back a slave from their master. And that's what God does for us. He pays a price we can't pay on our own to buy us back from hopelessness, from death, from a future that's cut off from the plans he has for us, to a life of meaning and redemption and beauty. It just sometimes takes longer than we want. I mean, it took David like 17 years between when he got anointed and when he actually became king. It took Joseph 13 years from when he was sold into slavery and then put into prison to when God actually redeemed his story and elevated him to a spot where he could make a difference and live out his purpose. It even took Paul a few years from being like this Christian murderer with some really gross stuff as a part of his story to being the greatest Christian that ever lived, who's going around the world to proclaim the truth of the gospel. And in your life, it might not always happen quickly, but God is always at work to redeem your story. So my prayer is that you and I and none of us at Revision would settle for smaller stories because we just don't think we can get past our regrets, because we're convinced that they're just the end of our story. I said it Sunday and I'll say it again. Your regret does not get the last word. That's not how God works. All your regret ever gets to be is the first sentence of your next chapter. One of my favorite authors and pastors and theologians is this guy named Dallas Willard, and he wrote just something profound that I have held on to for years. He says, nothing irredeemable has happened or can happen to us. So as you look back at your life, at the things you've done you wish you wouldn't have, the things you haven't done you wish you would have, and the things that have happened to you you wish weren't a part of your story, none of that is irredeemable. Because of what Jesus did for us when he died and rose again, nothing irredeemable has happened or can happen to us. Believe that tonight. Believe it, because God is working all things for good in your life. And no matter what has been a part of your story in the past, He's got a beautiful future for every single one of us. Your regrets do not get to have the last word. All they ever get to be is the first sentence of your next chapter.